We're very pleased that tonight we have a distinguished sports historian, Warren Goldstein. Warren is as a professor of history and chair of the history department at the University of Hartford. He received his BA and PhD degrees from Yale, and he is the author of 4 books: Playing for Keeps, A History of Early Baseball, which won the American Society for Sport History Book Award in 1990. In 2000, it was reprinted by Barnes & Noble as A History of Early Baseball, and has been in print continuously since 1989. Now, not too many books have been in print for that long. It doesn't quite match the Bible, but it's it's a portion of that anyway. Now, in 1993, he published A Brief History of American Sports with Elliott Gorn, and he is also the author of William Sloane Coffin, Jr., A Holy Impatience. Now, for those of us of a certain age, remember William Sloane Coffin because he was the chaplain, the Christian chaplain at Yale, and also played a very active role in the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War. In any case, Professor Goldstein has received fellowships from the John D. and Catherine MacArthur Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and others. His essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other national publications. Please join me in welcoming Warren Goldstein to Camden County College.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So let's work on the sound. Is this working okay? Yes. All right, people can hear me? Great, because I hate standing behind a podium. So you've got an outline here, and it's a funny outline. I don't think I'll get to everything on it. After I did the outline, I looked at it and I thought, because this could keep us here for a few nights. I probably won't get to everything, but I'll try to at least wave at most of the topics here. And of course, for those of you who are real baseball historians, you may enjoy looking on the flip side of the outline, because there you get to spend some time with Babe Ruth's batting statistics, which are always fun. When the Baseball Encyclopedia was first published, I still remember my college roommates and I sort of staying up till all hours of the night, just poring over these baseball records. If you've ever had the slightest interest in baseball statistics, you know what I'm talking about. But tonight I want to do something a little different. I want to be part of your discussion about the 1920s, and I want to zero in on the birth of mass culture, and particularly sports, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on Babe Ruth. Just so that's the spoiler alert. I thought I was going to do a whole lot of different people, but I decided, nah, I'm really going to focus on the Babe. And there are reasons for that, and I will talk about that. I was thinking and wondering how I was going to start tonight's talk, and then I was reading an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education by the eminent radical sociologist Todd Gitlin, and this quote just popped up. And actually, this is from Theodore Dreiser in the novelist, American Tragedy, Sister Carrie, and other extremely depressing but very well done novels. In 1923, Dreiser says this: "You can slam America's young people into universities with their classrooms and laboratories, and when they come out, all they can talk about is Babe Ruth. America is a hopeless country for intellectuals and thinking people." I had never seen that line from Dreiser, and I really used to like him. So what am I supposed to think? Now, nearly 100 years later, I'm going to spend the evening talking a lot about Babe Ruth to people that once were young and thought about Babe Ruth even more. That's Dreiser on sports. Clearly, there was a kind of bifurcation in American life in the 1920s where a lot of intellectuals sort of drew away from this new mass culture and then sort of started the kind of parlor game, which I think still kicks around among academia, among some intellectuals, where they like to look down their noses at popular culture. Those of us that spend time with sports history kind of go in the other direction. So I'm not part of those who look down their noses at popular culture. But before I can start talking about the 1920s, I have to go a little bit before. So some years ago, this is an anecdote, some years ago, it's a weird combination of circumstances, but I ended up at a dinner across the table from Janet Reno, who had recently been the Attorney General of the United States. This was in Miami, where she was very well known because she'd been a prosecutor in Miami-Dade County before going to Washington, D.C. So I didn't really fit there, but my wife brought me along, and there I was. And so she wanted to know what I taught. And she said, "So, Professor Goldstein, what do you teach?" And I was honest. I told her, well, I taught the U.S. History Survey, the second half of what we call the U.S. History Survey, which begins in most places at either 1865 at the end of the Civil War or 1877 at the end of Reconstruction. But she was so in this case I said, well, I teach this course, that begins U.S. history in 1865. And she really didn't like that. She said, well, how can you possibly teach a course that begins in 1865 when the Civil War has just happened? And I said, well, I try to talk about Lincoln's second inaugural as a way to get going. I talk a little bit about slavery in the war. And she says, but surely, how can you do that? Don't you have to start earlier? And then the rest of she was really having fun with me. This is a former prosecutor, after all, right? And I said, well, I suppose I could start, 20 or 30 years earlier. And they said, but surely, how can you really start with slavery in all of its glory in the South without starting earlier in American history? And then I realized it was going to be a really long evening. And she really had me, or so she thought. Of course, she didn't. Every history department, people make courses. And they teach them. And they generally aren't the history of the world from the beginning to the present. We actually have arbitrary dividing lines. We actually spend a lot of time thinking about what those dividing lines ought to be. And we actually think that there are reasons to stop and start at particular times. And I couldn't really say that to Janet Reno. I had to let her make me look like a fool in front of her fancy friends. But now that I'm here, I get to push back a little bit, and yet I'm going to do a little bit of what she wanted me to do. You can't talk about the 1920s without just a little bit about World War I and the end of World War I. And that's why you have that list in your outline. And I want to make sure that I at least wave at everything on that list. Because in many decades are reactions to what came before. There are important things that happened at the end of World War I and during World War I that set up the kind of really important things that were extremely turbulent in American history during the 1920s. So what are some of those things? So during World War I, the American economy worked at an absolutely, fever may be too intense a word to use, but the economy hummed through the war. The U.S. economy became the most productive industrial engine in the history of the world during World War I. The AFL-CIO gave, there was no CIO, the AFL gave a no strike pledge so that there were no workers going out on strike, and a war really stimulates an economy. A war stimulates an economy because you got to produce ships, bullets, cannons, uniforms, K-rations, all the kind of things that you need to be able to go to war. So during the war, the U.S. economy hummed. There was a kind of absolutely full employment, and the combination of the sort of lynching terrorism in the South and the draw of employment up north began something that we know as the Great Migration of African Americans from the rural South to the industrial cities of the North. When the war ended, however, it raised the kind of problem that always happens at the end of a war. What do you do with all of that productive capacity when you're not shooting a lot of bullets, dropping a lot of bombs, and producing a lot of destroyers? You don't need a lot of destroyers in peacetime. And the same with cannons, and the same with guns and machine gun bullets and the like. So it always presents a kind of a problem for those who are thinking about the American economy when a war is over. So that's one thing to hold in your minds. Secondly, During the war, we saw something called the Committee on Public Information, headed by a journalist named George Creel. The CPI, as historians call it was called at the time, is kind of the first big propaganda institution in the United States. Some of you may have heard or remember hearing about the 4 Minutemen, a sort of volunteer corps of some 75,000 Americans who used to, and every week the CPI would give them new scripts to convince people to buy war bonds or to enlist or to support the war in any of the myriad ways. And, in those days, movie theaters had almost always had a double feature. And so in between the first and the second feature, these 4 Minutemen would pop up and give a speech about the war, trying to whip up patriotism. But also the CPI was a kind of engine of censorship. It funneled information about the war, and it was active in building support for 2 interesting laws, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. So the CPI was, George Creel, who ran it, said afterwards in his memoirs, he really objected to it being called propaganda. And I've got a great quote here from Creel in his memoir, which he called How We Advertised America. I want you to hold on to that word, advertised, for just a minute, because that's crucial to understanding the 1920s. But you see the connection I'm making here. The connection I'm making is between what happened in the United States during the war and the end of the war, and how that then bleeds over, comes into the next decade. Here's what he says. In no degree was the committee an agency of censorship, a machinery of concealment or repression. By the way, that's a flat lie. Just so you know. But then memoirs often are lies. What the historian's job is to figure out what in a memoir is useful, and sometimes even lies are useful, but you have to know what's telling the truth and what isn't. Its emphasis throughout was on the open and the positive. At no point did it seek to or exercise authorities under those war laws that limited the freedom of speech and press. Not really true. In all things, from first to last, without halt or change, it was a plain publicity proposition. My goodness, all that alliteration, it's actually really hard to read. A plain publicity proposition, a vast enterprise in salesmanship, the world's greatest adventures in advertising. We did not call it propaganda, for that word in German hands had come to be associated with deceit and corruption. Our effort was educational and informative throughout, for we had such confidence in our case as to feel that no other argument was needed than the simple, straightforward presentation of the facts. This is what my late father used to call horse hockey. It is simply not true. The CPI was an extremely effective propaganda operation and trained thousands of former journalists and copywriters in the techniques of political persuasion, what we normally refer to as propaganda. So as the economy had to deal with stopping a kind of enormous industrial production during the war, at the same time, we also had a group of people who had been trained in techniques of persuasion. So, now, people often like to talk about the 20s as a time of enormous change, but a lot of that change was sort of begun by changes in the United States Constitution. The 18th and 19th Amendments, in particular, the 18th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, both 18th in 1919, 19th in 1920. The 18th Amendment, as most of you know, those of you that have hair the color of mine, and who have, and some of you are even losing it the way I am, you know what the 18th Amendment was. Those of you that have to study in history books all the time, it doesn't come to mind as immediately, but it was the Prohibition Amendment. The amendment to the U.S. Constitution that, astonishingly enough, it's really hard to recapture a period where that was the case, banned the sale and transport and production of spirituous liquors, including wine, and so otherwise known as prohibition. The 19th Amendment, of course, which was finalized in 1920, gave women the right to vote, or rather stopped restricting the right to vote on the basis of sex. Most of our amendments like that are phrased in a weird negative. The right to vote shall not be restricted on the basis of sex. That was a big deal in American history, and for a lot of people, it was weird. So we have this tendency, even in my profession from time to time, to think that we're on some long, continuous improvement. We think of things that are better today and were worse 100 years ago, and so we think that that was some kind of natural progression. But what historians see all the time is stuff like this. In African American history, I think the argument is often made that for every step forward, you get 2 steps backward. I think that the progress of women's rights is also something that was extremely halting. You see progress at some point, and then you see retrenchment. And that's probably, I hadn't known I was going to make the point, but that's a kind of a meta point about the study of history. And that is that, and it's a really hard one to sort of get into our heads. It's a really natural human thing, I find, to think that things are continuously getting better, or I suppose there's always the reverse. They're always getting worse. What's really hard is to grasp history as something in which there are advances, and then there are setbacks. And then there are advances again, and then there are setbacks again. It's very hard to see it all one way or all the other. However, emotionally, we may want to do something else. So the return of African Americans who fought in World War I, and they did in large numbers, turns out to have had caused a lot of problems for white folks. And when white folks are having problems with black people gaining more rights, that turns out to make problems for black folks. And so both Chicago and East St. Louis, Chicago in 1919, East St. Louis in 1917, erupted in extraordinarily vicious and lethal race riots. And in American race riots, in all American race riots, most of the people who die are black. Occasionally there's some white people who die, but the great majority of the people who die are black. And so one of the things that happened is that white folks were really ticked off seeing black men in uniforms walking the streets. That was worse for black men in the South. There are instances of black men in uniform, the uniforms that they had worn in Europe to win that war, coming back home, walking on streets of a southern city and being lynched for being uppity. That's why we often say, in terms of African American history, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And that's something that the more you look at the course of African American history, I think you can see some of that. Even today, you can see that in a kind of way that is extraordinarily distressing after the election of an African American president, and to see the kind of backlash against African Americans in the larger white culture and from the White House. But something else is in that list that I gave you, the Red Scare. The Red Scare. So during World War I, I'm talking much too much about this. How are we ever going to get to sports? So let's just say that the creation of the Soviet Union in 1917 and a strength of a socialist movement in American politics at that time produced a backlash. And it produced a really repressive backlash in which all kinds of immigrants and radicals and socialists, including Emma Goldman, were rounded up and deported for political reasons. Now, I got to start talking about mass entertainment culture, or we're never, ever going to get to sports. So if you bring together the enormous productive capacity of the American economy and no place for it to go, and you put that with people being trained in techniques of persuasion, you get some of the solution that the leaders of the American economy happened on. And it's something that happened in the 1920s, and it happened again, interestingly, in the late 40s and early 50s. And that is that the economy turned to the production of consumer goods on a mass scale. But most Americans didn't buy manufactured, mass-produced consumer goods before the 1920s. So how did you get people to do that? You advertised. And so what you see in the 1920s is the conversion of the propaganda arm of the US government into the birth of the advertising industry. And the advertising industry found its home in magazines, newspapers, billboards, and a brand new invention we're going to get to in just a moment called radio. And that new advertising industry, and if you look back, you can see the origin of almost all the great advertising firms of the 20th century were in the 1920s, often started with people who'd gotten their start in the Committee on Public Information during the war. And they began selling consumer goods at a rate that they had never been sold before. I think I got a great little statistic here. Newspaper, magazine, and billboard advertising quadrupled between 1917 and 1929. People began buying stuff on credit for the first time in American history. And believe me, trying to convince Americans to buy on credit took a lot of work. It was not businesses did that all the time. Large corporations did it all the time. Individuals and families didn't do that ever. So to convince people to pull money, to buy things on credit was a brand new thing, and the advertising industry helped to create the modern idea of credit as a way to buy things. And so a lot of the American economy in the 1920s was floated on credit that people got convinced by the advertising industry to engage in. So we might as well get to radio. It's really hard to overstate the influence of radio on American culture in the 1920s. At the same time, it's hard to grasp the enormous difference it made in American culture. I sometimes, when I teach U.S. history, and I do the whole survey course, of course starting in 1865, I explain to students that I think that the 1920s are the first decade that if my students were dropped down into the past, they would recognize as kind of modern. Because walking down a street, you would hear music playing. You would hear it coming out of saloons. You'd hear it coming out of homes and the like. The radio sort of made that happen. But the radio did more than make the country kind of modern. It brought people together in brand new ways so that people got to experience public happenings simultaneously. And that may not have been the same kind of community as you found at a local park or in a local ballpark. It did create a new kind of national community. And here's the thing about new forms of media, particularly, say, radio and also television, by the way. Suddenly, and by the way, radio really takes off in the 1920s. KDKA, let's see, I don't always get dates right. You know, a historian is supposed to know dates. But now there's something called the World Wide Web, and as a result, you don't have to remember dates anymore because you can always look them up, and if you can't, your students can in about 10 seconds on their phones. And that, by the way, is terrific. I love that because it means I don't really have to know it. So KDKA in Pittsburgh debuts in 1920. By 1923, there were more than 500 radio stations in the United States. You talk about growth. That is explosive growth of a brand new medium. By the end of the decade, there were radios in 12 million households. In other words, 40% of the US population had access to a radio. And here's an aside, by the way. By the 1932 campaign, pitting Franklin Roosevelt against Herbert Hoover, the single largest expense in both campaigns, even though Hoover was terrible at it, was radio. Absolutely. Absolutely. You have similar statistics about the growth of television in the 1950s. And of course, the use of television in political campaigns, which lagged a little bit. It was harder for people to figure out how to use it. So radio changed so much, but here's the thing I was saying about a new medium. Think of 500 radio stations. that can be on anywhere from 12, 15, or 24 hours a day. What do you fill it with? If you don't have an industry coming up with things to fill it with, what do you rely on? Music, eventually radio dramas, but also sports. And so the 1920s saw a growth in the popularity of a whole variety of sports, and radio helped make those sports popular, but at the same time, sports made radio popular. Those things happened simultaneously. And so that's one of the most important developments of the 1920s. And that helped to create radio and sports together in slightly larger, I make reference to larger issues as well, which I'll get to in just a second, but that created a mass entertainment culture. Before that, entertainment cultures were relatively local. You couldn't follow your favorite team. You couldn't follow the Phillies. You could not, except by going to the ballpark or reading about them in the newspaper. There was one other way. Especially at World Series times, sometimes newspapers would do these big scoreboards on the front of their buildings, and they would use telegraph to get the results instantaneously, and they'd move people around on those boards. That changed with radio sort of overnight. All those boards went away, and radios replaced them, and people listened to radios in their offices, in their homes, and sometimes in more collective environments. So radio was absolutely critical. So the combination of the advertising business, radio, mass magazines, and the possibility of transmitting photographs over telegraph wires, which technology got much better in the 1920s, meant that magazines and newspapers were filled with images of sports and other forms of celebrity. And the other forms of celebrity were mostly movie stars. Feature films had only begun with Birth of a Nation in 1915. By the 1920s, they were a growing, enormous business. And so we actually have kind of a new word in the American vocabulary, and that is celebrity. So I think I argue here in this outline that if we really want to understand the 1920s, we really have to talk about radio advertising and a new culture of celebrity. Sports heroes, which were lifted up by magazines and newspapers and radio and advertising at the same time, were some of the newest figures in the culture of celebrity. Red Grange, here was a college football player, was a very famous one, but he became a professional football player, was the first one represented by a press agent, a guy named Cash and Carry Pyle, who marketed him absolutely beautifully. There are so many. The reason why we know more sports heroes from different kinds of sports in the 1920s is precisely because it was possible to raise up people from many different sports to celebrity status. Let's see. Oh, I guess I have to. So Gertrude Ederle, the swimmer who swam the English Channel. Babe Ruth, we're going to get to in just a minute. Lou Gehrig, his teammate. Jack Dempsey, the fighter, and Joe Louis, and Gene Tunney. Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney fought twice in the 1920s. Their second fight in 1927 was at Soldier Field, and something like 105,000 people came to watch that match. But much more important for American history is that some 50 million people listened to the fight on the first real nationwide hookup of radio networks. See the difference? I mean, 105,000 people is a lot of people. You know, it's a real lot of people in a city that probably only had 1 million. Chicago in 1927, but that suddenly vaults to 50 million people by electronic networks. That's the power of sports, celebrity, advertising, because the fight was pushed everywhere, and of course sponsors, advertisers, not the business of advertising, but the companies who wanted their goods advertised bought into that. Do you see how these things all work together? That fight, the possibility of that fight being broadcast to 50 million people meant that advertisers were willing to pay money to get their goods advertised on that 50 million person hookup nationwide, which put more money into the pockets of athletes, their agents, the advertising industry, and radio stations themselves. Whenever you think about conceptualizing a new medium like radio or television, it's the people who run those networks are never really thinking about what the show is that they're putting out there. They're only thinking about the show in terms of how big an audience it can produce. So the owners of the stations can turn around and sell the audience to advertisers. And by advertisers, I mean washing machine manufacturers who use advertising agencies to do the ads that then show up on radio. So if you ever complain about the quality of TV shows on networks, which is certainly reasonable, you could do it if you want, even though we talk about a golden age of television, the key way to understand television, the key way to understand radio, is that they are ways of producing an audience for advertisers. That audience gets sold, rented, in a way, to advertisers. And so that's the only thing that the people that run networks ever think about. How can I get larger audiences that I can turn around and sell to advertisers? The first great example of this happened in the 1920s. And so Gene Tunney and Jack Dempsey got built as a fight of the century in that second fight. 50 million people at the same time. Well, we already did Joe Louis. So I made a brief mention of the New Woman. A lot of talk about the 1920s. Boy, am I late. Anyway, a lot of talk about the 1920s focuses on the flapper, right? Short skirts, bobbed hair, smoking cigarettes, dancing all night to hot jazz, right? It's a lovely image. I mean, it's really not, it's not particularly accurate. What is accurate, though, is that you see how women's body types change in the 1920s from a previous generation? So when you see the women of the 1920s, including women athletes of the 1920s, I don't have the images here to show you, but I have it in our book, Brief History of American Sports, which you can find at Amazon.com. And we've got a drawing of a female tennis player from the 19-teens, and she's wearing something completely different. She's wearing something with shoulder pads, a décolletage, and even something of a bustle. Women's body image of the late 19th and early 20th century was all about a very fleshy hourglass figure and the exaggeration of sexual characteristics in terms of the bust, shoulders, and derriere. Here in the 1920s, you see a total shift in female body type, so she's dressed much more boyishly, not actually emphasizing feminine curves at all. And when I look at her, I also think of the Great Gatsby, the character in The Great Gatsby that Fitzgerald wrote. Do you remember the golfer who was the sort of the sometime love interest for a while of Nick Carraway, the narrator? So she made, you could tell the 20s made F. Scott Fitzgerald really uneasy. Because even though he did very well in the 1920s, in The Great Gatsby, Jordan Baker is a female golfer. She's described as very mannish. And do you remember the key thing about her that turns Nick off about her? He remembers seeing some article about her and he can't quite remember. She was a cheat. She was a professional golfer, but she got caught for cheating. But listen to her name, right? Jordan Baker. How do we know that's a man, or how do we know it's a woman? right? So Fitzgerald was really uneasy about the sort of androgyny that seemed to be coming to the sports world. And Helen Will's, even though she's quite glamorous there, it's not a form of glamour that made him completely comfortable. Back to my outline. Big Bill Tilden in tennis. Bill Tilden, and I love this picture of Helen Wills playing tennis. Any tennis player would recognize the athleticism in that pose as she goes for the backhand, right? So, that's Ty Cobb. Ty Cobb was the greatest ball player before the Babe Ruth era. And so we talk about the 1920s as embodying a culture of consumption. And historians invented that term to distinguish the 20s from what we called earlier the culture of production. An entire culture organized around making stuff. People had, especially men, had got self-worth from creating things and from making things. And most of the jobs that people had defined them, and the way in which we admired people who were heroes of the culture were as people who made things. They produced things. I think of Ty Cobb as a perfect example of that ethic of the culture of production. This is a guy who was not particularly tall and not even particularly strong, but he also had the highest batting average in the history of the major leagues with 367 batting average. He had more stolen bases than anyone of his era. He used the skills that he had, and by the way, this is the pre-home run era in what Bill James calls long sequence offense. He was terrific at slap singles. He was terrific at bunts, which he beat out a lot. He was terrific at sharpening his spikes and using them to slash at the legs of opposing ball players. He was a guy he was a penny-pinching son of a bitch. And a racist, a horrible racist at the same time. And he was so unpopular, you may remember from the movie Field of Dreams. Actually, at one point, Joe Jackson comes out, and I think the main character says, well, where's Ty Cobb? And he says, we didn't ask him. Nobody liked the son of a bitch yet anyway. And it's true. At his funeral, there were like 3 people from Major League Baseball that showed up, and it turns out a bunch of kids who were visiting the Hall of Fame or wherever he was being. They were visiting something near where he was being buried. 3 people from Major League Baseball. Ty Cobb. So let's get to Ruth. I wish I could figure out. So there he is. See him in the middle? It's a perfect picture of Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth not only embodied everything I've been saying about the culture, what I'm about to say about the culture of consumption of the 1920s, he was the outstanding star of the 1920s. He might have been the most photographed human being in the 1920s and possibly the best known American, of that entire era. He changed the game of baseball by hitting home runs. You can see it by looking at his stats on the back. And you can see the way he had an absolute breakout year. By the way, everything in boldface means you led the league. But look at him in 1920 with the Yankees. He hit 11 home runs with Boston in 1918. In 1919 with the Red Sox, he hits 29, leads the league. But note that he led the league with 11 home runs. There was a guy named Home Run Baker who was well known for that. The most number of home runs he'd ever hit in a season was 12. Babe Ruth completely transformed the game. Look what he does from 19 to 1920, from 29 home runs, and then to 54 in 1920 and 59 in 1921. I think in 1920, when he hit 54, he also hit more than any other team in the American League or in the National League. He showed that you could do something different in baseball and therefore transformed it. Baseball before Ruth was Ty Cobb baseball. It was single, bunt the guy over, hit and run, sack fly. It could take as many as 4 or 5 batters to get a run in. Ruth showed that you could also see on that how many times he struck out. He swung in a completely different way. He showed the way the game could be played totally differently, and he transformed the game, because after him, the home run became a central part of the game, and it's never left the game. But Ruth was so much more than a baseball player. He was a genuine celebrity. He never really grew up. He loved being photographed with kids. His spending habits were astonishing. He would wear silk shirts once and throw them away. His appetites were immense, his appetites of all kinds. He could sit down, and he was rumored to be able to polish off a couple of dozen hot dogs at a sitting, a couple of pitchers of beer, and his roommates on the road have left descriptions of his sexual appetites, which are similarly sort of Paul Bunyan-esque. And I mean, there's a story of him actually pulling up alongside. He had this sort of fancy roadster. It was well known all over New York. He pulled up at a stoplight next to a woman. They exchanged pleasantries, and the Babe got out of his car and accompanied her, leaving his car in the middle of Fifth Avenue. That's sort of who he was. And he would get in trouble with his team because he would stay out too late, he'd drink too much. Once he was supposed to have had a stomach ache heard round the world. Most historians think it was probably an STD of some kind that laid him low for a while. There are so many grandchildren of Babe Ruth out there, we will never know. There was, by the way, an increase in birth control in the 1920s, but not enough to make up for Babe Ruth's philandering. He had a bad memory for his teammates' names. He called everybody kid, which was kind of appropriate. People talked about him as a kid. He never really grew up. And he was always comfortable around other kids. And so a lot of the pictures that have been taken of him over the years that come down to us, visiting the sick kid in the hospital. We don't know if this is the one he's supposed to have hit the home run for, the called shot. So let's just go back here. No. Let's go here. Might as well get here. Babe Ruth was the first baseball player, and actually the first athlete, to have his own press agent. And in fact, he made more. He was the first athlete, the first professional athlete, to make more off the field than he made on the field. His press agent, Christy Walsh, was a very smart, out-of-work newspaper man who knew he wanted to ghostwrite for Ruth. So he found out where everyone knew where Ruth was living, apparently the Ansonia Hotel in New York City. But Walsh got to know his bootlegger. It's the 1920s, after all, right? So he got to know the guy who delivered booze on a regular basis to Ruth's hotel room. And he paid him one day so that he could go instead. And Ruth barely noticed that there was a new guy there and Walsh just talked a blue streak and told him that he'd wanted to work for him and said he would ghostwrite articles. And Ruth had done some ghostwriting, so to speak. Other people had written articles under his name, but Ruth had made like $5 a piece. And Walsh said he could make him $1,000 in the first month. And then he went out and borrowed $1,000 and wrote Ruth a check in the first week. And Ruth thought that Walsh had done that, and Walsh became his press agent. And so then Walsh booked him all over the country. Babe sold Quaker puffed wheat. He sold cars, different kinds of cars. He sold cigarettes. He sold liquor. He sold shirts. He sold shoes. He was, my friend Elliot Gordon and I invented this phrase in our book, Brief History of American Sports. He was kind of a walking billboard for the culture of consumption. And yet also the most loved celebrity in America. The fact that he cheated on his wives didn't seem to break through. Sports writers were happy to shield him from all of that. Look at the kind of pictures. I mean, he was a man's man as well. He would go hunting, he would go fishing. This is a famous picture of Ruth. It's interesting because he was a pretty happy man, but a lot of the pictures show a kind of a somber side. And I find myself wondering, I mean, there hasn't been a recent biography of Ruth, but he had a really tough childhood. I mean, he was basically being committed to reform school by the time he was 6 because he was stealing on the streets of Baltimore. His father beat the crap out of him. was a really brutal saloon keeper. There he is as a younger man with the Red Sox before the world's worst trade, before the most consequential trade in all of baseball history, and one that the Red Sox missed for a long time. Anyway, I don't want to do the statistics. Before I end, though, I don't want to end just with Babe Ruth, and there's so much more, as I told you I could say, and I've done a really lousy job of covering everything on the outline. But I do want to talk briefly about a different kind of 1920s. Because again, we have this idea that everything in the 1920s was this kind of whirl of celebrity and Gatsby-esque parties and flappers and the like. And there's a part of that that's true, but there's another 1920s. And I've given you a list here under number 5, which is worth paying a little bit of attention to. The Second Klan was born in 1915 and became a mass social movement in the early 1920s. It had mostly died out by the late 20s, but before it died out, it helped to pass the 1924 Immigration Restriction Bill. The Second Klan of the 1920s was not only anti-black, it was also anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic, and spread across the North all over the place. There were mass parades and rallies. It was a respectable kind of fraternal order, and it married evangelical Protestantism and anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism and anti-black racism, and with a kind of suspicion of elites. Sound familiar? These sorts of things happen in American history. It was a kind of a populist movement that some people say didn't have a whole lot of effect. But my friend Linda Gordon, who teaches at NYU, has a book coming out next month called The Second Coming of the Ku Klux Klan, about the Klan of the 1920s. And she really lays out the ways in which the Klan was actually kind of successful. It helped to enshrine eugenics, the science of racial superiority, in the minds of millions of Americans, and lots of states passed sterilization statutes. The history of eugenics in this country is shameful. It happened to focus on the mentally ill and African Americans, who often could be sterilized against their will in the name of creating a better racial stock, which of course turned into something quite a lot more dangerous in Europe in the 1930s. The other thing that, people don't pay much attention to is in this extraordinary liberal decade where there actually was a lot more premarital sex, when women were smoking cigarettes, when there was this kind of new culture of consumption, the United States voters also elected, look at that list, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. 3 stodgy conservative Republicans. So the 20s are a kind of bifurcated decade, and we can't really just think about Ruth's celebrity and the kind of liberal social mores without also understanding you had a growth of completely unregulated capitalism. You had the highest income inequality in American history until now, in 1929. You had completely unregulated corporate capitalism and a stock market, which crashed spectacularly at the end of the decade. That didn't just happen in 1929. The seeds of the crash and the Depression were being planted in the 1920s. So the last thing I want to do is to show you that there's also, most of what I've been talking about is white culture, as opposed to African American culture during this time. And that's partly because that's the way the historical literature has gone. But aside from the Harlem Renaissance, people don't spend a whole lot of time talking about African American culture in the 1920s. So I just want to say a little bit about it before opening it up to questions. So black baseball had always thrived, often right next to white baseball. The Negro National League, founded in 1920 by Rube Foster, who was an extraordinary pitcher, and then a pretty good businessman, put together a league of clubs mostly in the Midwest. He tried to get Eastern clubs too, but then it turned out there was an Eastern colored league, and Foster was smart enough to realize that they could play a Negro World Series, from time to time, and that would also make for publicity and more money for his players, but also for him and for the league owners. There wasn't much interest in integration on the part of the white majors because black teams were paying rent to white ballpark owners. That's something that went right through 1947. In fact, there's a really fun kind of document that Lee McPhail, president of the New York Yankees, produced for Major League Baseball, that is to say white baseball, in 1946, before Jackie Robinson came into the league, opposing integration of baseball. Why? Well, for one thing, the New York Yankees were making $100,000 a year by renting out their Yankee Stadium to black ball players, to black clubs. All that rent disappeared when the Negro leagues collapsed after Robinson came in, and there were no more Negro leagues. But Rube Foster developed the first National Negro League, and those clubs were key parts of African American culture in black parts of U.S. cities. They were never as distant from the surrounding community. They didn't travel to fancy hotels. They were often feted by local fraternal organizations. In Kansas City, I think, opening day for the Monarchs, there were parades all through town, and fraternal and sororal organizations and marching bands were all of a part of it. They were really a community institution. They were a community institution, and black baseball was so good that at the end of the regular season, white ball players would form all-star teams, and sometimes their main teams, and they would go what was called barnstorming, which means they would travel around and play against the teams that they called the colored clubs, the black baseball clubs. And the folks that have done the research on this have done a lot of really great digging and discovered that black teams frequently whooped the white major leaguers. They frequently beat them. They beat them with great regularity. The other thing that happened, and this is something that most of us have not paid close attention to, and I mean by us, I mean sports historians. Fortunately, there's a brand new book, a year or two old now, a great book on it called Race Ball, R-A-C-E-B-A-L-L, by a guy named Rob Ruck, R-U-C-K. And his book, it's called Race Ball, How the Major Leagues Colonized Caribbean Baseball. And it turns out, he argues, the real center of baseball talent, the pinnacle of baseball talent in the 20th century was in the Caribbean. And one city above all was the center, Havana. Because that's where the white major leaguers went to play in the winter. It's where black players went to play in the winter also. And it's where Latino players played all the time. It was not segregated. There were no segregated teams, so talent rose to the top, and the white players knew that they were playing a different quality of baseball when they were playing in the Caribbean. That's a story that has yet to break through into our national consciousness. That began in the 1920s. And if you only read one book in baseball history, in the next couple of years, don't read mine. Mine's based on old research, and there's a lot more new stuff. Read this book, Race Ball, because that'll change the way you think about the history of the game. It'll help you understand why later in the 1930s, Josh Gibson, the great Negro League catcher who died penniless and basically insane, some people called him the Black Babe Ruth, but other people called Babe Ruth the White Josh Gibson. And he went to his grave thinking that he should have played in the majors, which is true. He should have. And also Rube Foster, who created the Negro National League, he had a gas leak in his home in 1925, 1926. He fell ill. He never really recovered. He was committed to an insane asylum where he spent the last 4 years of his life, dying in 1930. And what was the thing that made him insane? What did he tell everyone around him? That he was waiting for a call to pitch in the World Series. And that's how he ended his life, one of the great black entrepreneurs of the middle 20th century. Anyway, I need to stop so you all could ask some questions.